Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. We asked the Ouija board what it wanted. It spelled out, you. It started as a joke. You know, one of those random ideas you get when you're hanging out with friends and everyone's trying to one-up each other with how far they're willing to go. I wish I had trusted my gut when I first saw the box. It wasn't one of those modern Ouija boards you could pick up from a store. No, this one looked old, like way older than any of us. We were at my friend Evan's house. His parents were out of town, so naturally, we decided it was a perfect night to get into something creepy, something we could all laugh about later. No one expected the night to get as weird as it did. I mean, how could we? The board was found in his basement. Evan had been looking for an extension cord when he came back upstairs holding it, grinning like he'd just discovered treasure. "Look what I found," he said, dropping it onto the coffee table. The wooden box had this strange, burnt design on the top, faded like it had been used a lot. None of us thought much of it. Probably just an old decoration from when his parents were younger. But when Evan opened it up, the wooden planchette inside looked untouched, like it hadn't aged at all. I should have said something then. I don't know why I didn't. There was something wrong about the whole vibe of that thing, but instead of speaking up, I stayed quiet. That's when it all began. Now, if you've ever been part of one of these Ouija board sessions, you probably know the rules. Don't play alone. Never ask it when you'll die, and always say goodbye. But none of us took it seriously. It was just a game, right? We dimmed the lights and all sat around the table, our hands awkwardly placed on the planchette. The first few questions were a joke. "Is anyone there?" Evan asked, smirking as he looked at us, clearly expecting one of us to move the piece. But no one did. The planchette stayed still. Nothing. We all rolled our eyes, figuring this was going to be a bust, but then, out of nowhere, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I could feel the air get heavier, colder, like someone had cracked open a window, except the windows were shut tight. No one said anything, but I could see it in their faces. They felt it too. Evan tried again. "Is anyone with us?" This time, the planchette twitched. I swear none of us moved it, but it was subtle, like a vibration. And then, it slid slowly to yes. We all froze. "Who's here?" Maddie asked, her voice shaky. I could tell she was trying to sound tough, but her eyes were darting around the room like she expected something to jump out at us. The planchette didn't move for a long moment. We sat there in silence, waiting. I could feel the tension in the air thickening, like something was watching us. Slowly, painfully slowly, the planchette began to move again. It spelled out D-A-R-K. "What's dark?" Evan asked, more curious than afraid. He was always the bold one, always wanting to push boundaries. The rest of us? Not so much. Again, the board spelled out another word. H-A-N-D. "Dark hand," I whispered, feeling my heart speed up a little. What the hell is a dark hand? No one had an answer. The room felt so still, like the air itself had been sucked out. And then Maddie asked the question that I regret most of all. "What do you want?" It didn't even hesitate. The planchette shot to the letters with more force than before. Y-O-U. We all pulled our hands away at the same time, the board still sitting there in front of us, like it was waiting for us to respond. I felt a knot in my stomach. I laughed, but it came out forced, weak. "Okay, this is getting weird." Evan tried to play it off, brushing it aside as nothing. But the way his eyes shifted toward the board told me he wasn't as calm as he pretended to be. None of us were. "I'm done," Maddie said, standing up. "This is stupid. We should stop." But Evan didn't. He reached for the planchette again, ignoring the way Maddie glared at him. "One more question." I wanted to stop him, to just grab the board and throw it in the trash, but I didn't. I let him keep going. And that's when everything went from weird to downright terrifying. He placed his hand back on the planchette and asked, "Where are you right now?" The board didn't respond immediately. We all just sat there, holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. I don't know how long passed, but suddenly the planchette shot to one word, H-E-R-E. The lights flickered, once, twice, and then darkness. The power cut out completely. None of us moved. I could barely see my friends in the dim light from Evan's phone, which was still sitting on the table. "This is insane," Maddie whispered. Her voice was barely audible, like she was afraid speaking too loud would make things worse. "Relax," Evan said, trying to sound cool, but even his voice wavered. "It's just a power outage." Except, it wasn't. The lights flickered back on after a minute, but something felt different. Wrong. I could feel it deep in my gut, like we weren't alone in that room anymore. And then we all heard it. A faint knock. It wasn't from the door. It was closer. It was coming from the Ouija board. Can't explain the sound, not in a way that makes sense. It wasn't just a knock. It felt like a signal. Hollow, like someone was rapping their knuckles against the wood, except it wasn't coming from any of us. None of us moved. Maddie stood frozen by the couch, eyes locked on the board like it was a live wire ready to shock her. Evan, still trying to keep his cool, slowly pushed back from the table, his chair squeaking louder than I'd ever heard it. But his eyes were wide, almost as if he was daring the board to do something else. "Did you hear that?" Maddie whispered, like speaking louder would make whatever it was notice her. "Yeah," I said, barely managing to get the word out. The room felt stifling, like the walls were closing in, the air heavy and thick. The knock had echoed in a way that made my skin crawl. I hadn't realized I was gripping the edge of my chair until my knuckles turned white. Evan finally broke the silence. "It's just the house settling." He was lying. We all knew it. The look on his face gave him away. He was trying to convince himself more than us. That's when the knocking came again, louder this time. And it wasn't just a single knock, it was 3, like something or someone was trying to get our attention. Maddie gasped, stepping back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. "What the hell, Evan? You said this was a joke!" Evan didn't answer. His eyes were glued to the Ouija board. The planchette hadn't moved since it spelled out "you," but something about it, I don't know, it felt like it was alive, like it was waiting for us to do something, to react. I stood up. My legs were shaking, but I didn't care anymore. "Let's just put it away. This is too weird." Evan finally broke his stare and nodded, quickly grabbing the planchette and throwing it into the box. He slammed the lid shut, and for a moment, I thought that was it, that we'd put an end to whatever was happening. But the moment he closed the lid, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like something was pressing down on us and no one could catch their breath. Then, without warning, the lights flickered again. Once, twice, and then they cut out completely. We were plunged into total darkness. I can't do this," Maddie's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Evan, turn on your phone light." Evan fumbled for his phone, but as soon as the screen lit up, we saw it. All of us did. There was something standing in the corner of the room. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, like some kind of shadow from the dim light. But no, this was no shadow. It had a shape, a presence. It was taller than any of us, with long, distorted arms that hung unnaturally by its sides. Its head, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't human. I could barely breathe. It was like the air had been sucked out of the room. "What the—" Evan's voice was trembling now. He stood there, frozen, the phone shaking in his hand. The light from the screen was barely enough to make out the figure, but we all saw it. It wasn't moving, just watching. And then it stepped forward. Just one step. "Run!" Maddie screamed, She bolted for the door, and I wasn't far behind. "Evan!" He stood there like he was glued to the floor, unable to move. I grabbed his arm and yanked him hard, dragging him toward the door with me. We didn't look back as we ran out of the house, the air outside freezing compared to the stifling heat that had choked us inside. Maddie was already halfway down the street, gasping for breath as she looked back at us, her face pale. "What the hell was that?" she screamed, panic and fear mingling in her voice. I had no answer. None of us did. Evan stood next to me, clutching his knees, trying to catch his breath. It's just some kind of trick, right? Maybe someone..." But his voice trailed off. He didn't believe his own words. I didn't either. "Evan, that wasn't a trick," I snapped. "That thing, whatever it was real. You saw it. We all saw it." I could see the disbelief on his face, the same disbelief I felt crawling up my spine. We'd all seen it, standing there in the corner of the room, watching us. And then I realized something. We hadn't said goodbye. We didn't finish the session, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The words sounded stupid as they left my mouth, but deep down, I knew they were true. The rules of the Ouija board were stupid, sure, but something felt unfinished. We hadn't closed it out. And now, whatever we'd contacted was still with us. Evan's eyes met mine, wide with realization. "We have to go back." "No!" Maddie shook her head, backing away from us. "No way. I'm not going back in there. Are you insane?" "We didn't say goodbye," I repeated, my voice firmer now. "We need to close it. Otherwise, I don't know what happens." But deep down, I had a feeling I did know. Something had come through that board, and it wasn't done with us. Evan wiped his face, his hands trembling. "We go back in, say goodbye, and then we're done. For real this time." Maddie was shaking her head, but I could tell she knew we didn't have a choice. None of us did. We stood outside the house for a long time, staring at the front door, waiting for one of us to make the first move. The windows were dark, no sign of movement from inside, but the air was still thick with that same feeling, like something was watching us from behind those walls, waiting. Finally, Evan stepped forward, leading the way back inside. The second we crossed the threshold, I felt it, that cold, suffocating pressure in the air. The lights were still out, and the house was dead silent, too silent. We made our way back to the living room where the Ouija board sat on the coffee table. The box was still closed, but the planchette was back on the board. I hadn't put it there. None of us had. I felt a chill run through me, not the kind you get when you're cold. No, this was different. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from that board as possible. But we didn't. We sat down around it again, hands hovering just above the planchette, like before. No one wanted to touch it. No one wanted to be the first. "Let's just say goodbye and get the hell out of here," Evan whispered, breaking the silence. Maddie nodded, her eyes locked on the board, too scared to look up. I didn't blame her. I felt it too. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't done with us yet. Evan took a deep breath, his hand trembling as he reached for the planchette. Before he could touch it, the board spelled out one more word. N-O. For a moment, none of us moved. The planchette rested at the top of the board, right on no. No one had touched it. I was sure of that. "I didn't..." Evan started, but his voice faltered. His hand was still frozen in mid-air, just inches from the board. The room felt colder now, like the heat had been sucked right out of the house, leaving us surrounded by this icy, unnatural chill. "We need to get out of here," Maddie whispered, her voice barely a breath. She stood up so fast that her chair tipped over with a loud crash, but she didn't care. "I'm not doing this anymore. I don't care about the rules. We need to leave." But we all knew it wasn't that simple. The board had answered us, had refused to let us end the session. Even I could feel the weight of that. I didn't believe in this stuff, none of us did. But now, in that moment, The rules seemed real, terrifyingly real. Evan swallowed hard, his face pale, but he didn't move. "We can't leave. Not yet." His voice was shaky, but he was right. We had to finish what we started, or we'd never be rid of whatever was attached to that board. We have to close it out. Properly. "Close it out?" Maddie shot back, her eyes wide with panic. "The damn thing said no. Do you think it's going to just let us walk away?" Her words sent a wave of dread through me. She was right. It had refused us, and that meant something was still holding on. Something that didn't want us to leave. And I could feel it now, like an invisible hand was squeezing my chest, making it hard to breathe. "We don't have a choice," Evan said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. He didn't know what to do any more than the rest of us. The planchette started to move again. Slowly, deliberately. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to see where it was going, but my eyes were glued to the board, unable to look away. ITS. Evan's breath hitched as the planchette moved with increasing speed. ITS. "It's what?" Maddie asked, her voice trembling, barely able to get the words out. The planchette slid across the board, faster now, as if whatever was controlling it was getting impatient. It shot to one word: FORYOU. The room seemed to tilt. The lights flickered, dimming until the shadows stretched longer across the room, almost swallowing us in darkness. "What does that mean?" Maddie's voice cracked as she backed away from the board, shaking her head in disbelief. "What is for us? What is it talking about?" We didn't have to wait long for the answer. A creak echoed from the far side of the room, where the shadows were darkest. At first it was faint, like the house settling again. But then I realized it was getting louder, closer. I could see Evan's face draining of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I didn't need him to say anything. We all knew where the sound was coming from. It was coming from the corner of the room, the same corner where we'd seen that thing standing before. I felt something inside me scream to run, to get out of that house as fast as possible. But my legs felt like lead. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. And then I saw it. The shape. The same dark figure from before, but this time it was clearer. It wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving. Slowly, deliberately, like it knew exactly what it was doing, and it was coming for us. I could make out its long, distorted limbs, its face, or what should have been a face, hidden in the shadows. But the worst part wasn't what it looked like. It was what I felt. It wasn't just watching us. It was claiming us. I could feel it in the air, that sickening sense that we weren't just playing a game anymore. We were part of something much darker, something we couldn't escape. Maddie screamed and bolted for the door, but before she could reach it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the house, rattling the windows. We were trapped. "Open it!" Maddie yelled, frantically tugging at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. Evan rushed over to help her, but it was like the door had sealed itself shut, like something was holding it closed from the other side. I backed up until my legs hit the edge of the couch. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in the corner. It wasn't moving fast, but it didn't need to. Every slow step it took brought with it an overwhelming sense of dread, like I could feel it pulling the life right out of me. "We need to say goodbye," I muttered, my voice barely audible. My hands were shaking, my thoughts racing, but I knew it was the only way. "We need to finish the game, now." Evan and Maddie were too busy with the door, but I couldn't wait for them. I dropped to my knees in front of the board, my fingers trembling as I reached for the planchette. It was cold, so cold it burned my skin. "Goodbye," I whispered, trying to push the planchette to the word. But it wouldn't move. The planchette stayed frozen, stuck in place, like something was holding it down. I pushed harder, panic rising in my chest, but but it wouldn't budge. Then, the knocking started again. Not from the board this time, from the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, the same pattern as before. The room was ice cold now. I could see my breath in the air, but it wasn't just the temperature. It was the feeling of something wrong, something unnatural. The figure in the corner stopped moving. It was just standing there again, watching us, waiting. And the knocking continued, louder, more insistent. Maddie and Evan stopped struggling with the door, both of them staring at the wood as if something was about to break through. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, Maddie whispered, "Who's there?" For a second, nothing happened. The silence stretched on, suffocating. And then the knocking stopped. But the door didn't open. Instead, the planchette moved, slowly, purposefully. It spelled out one last word, M-E. The word on the board sent a cold wave of terror through me. Me. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever, or whatever, was knocking at the door wasn't just something from the board. It was here, with us. Evan backed away from the door, his face pale, sweat glistening on his forehead, despite the icy chill in the room. Maddie had her hands pressed over her mouth, eyes wide with disbelief, like she couldn't process what was happening. And honestly, neither could I. The knocking had stopped, but that only made it worse. The silence hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Every second that passed felt like something was creeping closer, getting ready to pounce. "We need to leave," I whispered, though I wasn't sure anyone heard me. My voice was shaky, barely there. But deep down, I knew we weren't getting out. Not until this thing was done with us. We'd opened a door to something we didn't understand, and now it was right outside, waiting. "Try the door again," Evan muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. His hand hovered near the handle, but he didn't touch it. Maddie shook her head, backing further into the corner. No, we can't open it. Whatever's out there, it's not human. We can't let it in." The words hung in the air, sinking into all of us. It wasn't human. I hadn't wanted to admit it, but Maddie was right. Whatever we'd summoned with that stupid game wasn't something we could explain away. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't someone playing a prank. It was real, and it wanted us. "I'm not staying here," Evan said, trying to sound braver than he was. His hand finally wrapped around the doorknob, knuckles white from the force of his grip. He tugged, hard, but the door didn't move. He pulled again, more desperate this time, but the door stayed locked tight, like something was holding it shut from the other side. "That's not possible," Evan muttered, pulling harder, but it was no use. The door wouldn't budge, and then, from the other side of the door, we heard it, breathing. Low, raspy breaths, like someone was standing right on the other side, pressing their face against the wood. We all heard it. There was no mistaking it now. Something was out there. Something was waiting. Maddie was shaking, her back pressed to the wall, her eyes locked on the door. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. I didn't have an answer. I wanted to say we'd be fine, that this was all just some horrible trick, but I couldn't. The breathing outside the door was too real, too close. It wasn't leaving. And the longer we stayed there, the more I could feel it. The pressure, the weight of something watching us, pushing in from all sides. "We have to finish it," I finally said, my voice stronger than I felt. "We have to end the session properly." Evan turned to me, his eyes wide with fear. "We tried that. It said no. What are we supposed to do now?" I looked back at the Ouija board, still sitting on the coffee table, the planchette resting on the word me. My stomach churned just looking at it, but I knew we couldn't just leave it like this. If we didn't finish what we started, we'd be trapped in here with whatever was lurking outside that door. "Sit down," I said, more firmly this time. "We're going to try again." Maddie didn't move at first, her eyes darting between me and the door, but eventually she sank down next to me. Evan followed, his hands shaking as he reached for the board. I hesitated before putting my fingers on the planchette, the cold wood sending a shiver up my spine. We're going to say goodbye, okay? All of us. We're ending this. Maddie nodded, her face pale. Evan just stared at the board, his mouth pressed into a tight line. Taking a deep breath, I placed my hand on the planchette. Maddie and Evan did the same, their fingers brushing against mine. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in on us from all sides. I could feel the weight of the room, like something was crouching just behind us, waiting. Goodbye, I whispered, pushing the planchette toward the word. It barely moved, like something was resisting us, holding it back. I pushed harder, my hands trembling, but the planchette barely inched forward. Come on, Evan muttered through clenched teeth, his hands shaking as he pushed harder. Maddie was sobbing quietly, her fingers trembling against the planchette, but she didn't let go. We pushed together, forcing the planchette across the board. It moved slowly, agonizingly slow, like we were dragging it through molasses. But it was moving. Finally, it reached the word goodbye. We all exhaled at once, the tension in the room easing just slightly. I felt a flicker of hope, like maybe, just maybe, we'd done it. Maybe it was over. But then, the lights flickered again, dimming until we were almost in complete darkness. The breathing outside the door stopped. For a second, everything was silent. And then the door rattled. Not gently, like someone knocking, but violently, as if something was trying to break it down. The wood groaned under the pressure, the hinges squeaking as the door shuddered in its frame. Oh God, Maddie whimpered, backing away from the table. It's not working. It's not leaving. Evan stood up, panic written all over his face. We said goodbye. Why isn't it working? The door rattled again, harder this time, the wood splintering slightly under the force. Whatever was outside wasn't going to wait much longer. We have to go, I said, standing up, my legs shaking beneath me. We can't stay here. We can't get out, Maddie whispered, her eyes wide with terror. We can't. Suddenly, the rattling stopped. The door went still. The air in the room shifted, becoming deathly quiet, like even the house was holding its breath. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything was still. Too still. And then, we heard the softest, most chilling sound I've ever heard in my life. The door handle turned. The sound of the door handle turning sent a wave of pure terror through me. I felt frozen, rooted to the spot as I watched the knob twist. The slow creak of metal echoing in the dead silence of the room. No one moved. Maddie was pressed against the wall, her eyes wide and glassy, barely breathing. Evan stood in the middle of the room, staring at the door like he couldn't believe what was happening. I wanted to scream, to shout, to do anything, but my voice felt trapped in my throat, my body refusing to listen to my brain's desperate commands to move. The handle finished turning with an agonizingly slow click, and then the door just opened. It didn't slam open like in a horror movie. No, it was worse. It opened quietly, with this horrible, deliberate slowness. The darkness beyond the door seemed to bleed into the room, as if the house itself was inviting something in. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The door hung open, the hallway beyond it empty. But the air was wrong, thick, cold, oppressive. It was like the atmosphere itself was warning us that something was about to come through. Something we couldn't stop. Then, there was a sound. It wasn't footsteps. No, it was more like dragging. Like something heavy was being pulled across the floor, scraping against the wood. Evan took a step back, his eyes fixed on the hallway. What the hell is that? We didn't have to wonder for long. Out of the darkness it appeared. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was just a shape, an outline of something that didn't quite fit with reality. It moved wrong, its body jerking in unnatural angles, like it was being yanked forward by invisible strings. The figure that had watched us from the corner earlier was now stepping through the doorway, but this time I could see it clearly. Its face, or where a face should have been, was covered in a dark, featureless mass. No eyes, no mouth. Just an empty, hollow blackness that seemed to absorb the light around it. Its limbs were too long, bending at strange, sharp angles as it dragged itself forward, slow and deliberate. Maddie let out a choked sob, her back pressed hard against the wall as the thing entered the room. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. It didn't feel real, like my brain was refusing to process what I was seeing. But it was real. Too real. And it was coming for us. The thing stopped in the middle of the room, standing unnervingly still. Then, without warning, its head jerked toward me. My stomach dropped. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The figure took another slow, deliberate step toward me, its limbs creaking and cracking with every movement, like it hadn't used them in centuries. We said goodbye, I stammered, my voice barely audible, trembling as I backed away. We did everything right. We ended it. You're supposed to leave. The figure didn't stop. Its body seemed to stretch as it neared me, growing taller, more distorted. The darkness that clung to it began to seep out, filling the room like a thick, suffocating fog. Evan grabbed a chair, his face twisted in panic. "Stay back!" he shouted, swinging it wildly in front of him. "Stay the hell away from us!" But the thing didn't react. It didn't flinch. It kept moving, dragging its twisted body closer and closer, inch by inch. And then it stopped, right in front of me. For what felt like an eternity, it loomed over me, its featureless face inches from mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. All I could feel was the crushing weight of its presence, pressing down on me, drowning me in an overwhelming sense of dread. Then it whispered, not out loud, but in my head. A voice so soft, so cold, it felt like ice was being poured into my skull. You. It didn't speak like a person. It was more like a statement, a claim, as if it had already made its decision, as if this thing had chosen me. And then it moved. Not toward me, but toward the Ouija board. It placed one of its long, bony fingers on the planchette. The board rattled under its touch, the letters shaking as it began to spell something out. The room seemed to close in, the walls darkening, the air growing colder by the second. The planchette moved quickly, jerking across the board with a speed and force none of us had ever seen. M-I-N-E. A wave of nausea hit me. I stumbled back, my legs finally obeying me as I backed away from the board. But it wasn't done. The planchette moved again, this time more slowly, deliberately. T-I-M-E-S-U-P. Maddie screamed, the sound cutting through the air like a knife. "What does that mean?" she shouted, tears streaming down her face. Evan's voice was barely above a whisper, his face pale as he stared at the board. I think it means we were never supposed to play." Before any of us could respond, the lights flickered one last time. Then everything went black. In the darkness, I could hear the breathing again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the door. It was right behind me. The Ouija board gave us a warning. Run. We should have listened. Don't know why we did it. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was that teenage thrill of doing something we knew was wrong. Or maybe we just didn't believe anything could actually happen. But if I'd known what would come next, I never would have touched that thing. It was one of those nights where nothing was happening. You know the kind, sitting around, scrolling through our phones, waiting for something exciting to break the monotony. There were 5 of us at Lisa's house. Me, Lisa, Matt, Josh, and Erin. We'd all been friends since middle school, and Lisa's basement had always been our hangout spot. That night, though, something felt off. Maybe it was the weather. The wind had picked up outside, and every now and then we'd hear the windows creak. The power flickered once, but Lisa said that happened all the time. It wasn't the house. It wasn't even the wind. It was this feeling, this weird energy between us. Like we were all waiting for something to happen, but none of us wanted to admit it. Lisa was the one who brought it up. "Hey, Remember that Ouija board my mum gave me for Halloween last year? I froze. I'd heard the stories. We all had. I wasn't superstitious or anything, but I wasn't exactly keen on summoning ghosts either. Lisa, though, always had a knack for pushing the envelope, for turning a quiet night into something none of us could ignore. No way, Josh laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Come on, it's just a game, Lisa said, already pulling it out from behind the couch. The box was dusty, like she hadn't touched it since the day she got it, and I immediately felt that sinking feeling in my gut. That quiet warning your instincts give you, but you ignore because you don't want to be the buzzkill. We can ask it something simple, Matt said, leaning in. Like, I don't know, see if it knows what we're thinking or something. The planchette was small, lighter than I expected. When we put our fingers on it, I felt this strange jolt, like an electric shock, but nobody else seemed to notice. They were all laughing, cracking jokes. Lisa lit a candle for atmosphere, and it flickered wildly, almost as if it was reacting to what we were about to do. Who's going to start? Erin asked, looking around. She was the quietest one of us, but she had a curiosity that usually got her roped into things she wouldn't do on her own. I will, Lisa said, because of course she would. Is anyone here with us? We all sat there in silence, our fingers barely touching the planchette. I could hear Matt's leg bouncing nervously under the table, the soft tap-tap-tap of his foot against the floor. Nothing happened at first, and I was ready to roll my eyes and call it a night. But then, the planchette started to move. Slowly, gently. I thought someone was messing around. Josh, maybe. He was always trying to get a rise out of people. But when I looked up, I saw the expression on his face, and he looked as freaked out as I felt. The planchette circled around the board for what felt like forever, finally landing on the letter R. R. Lisa laughed nervously. Okay, let's keep going. It moved again, this time faster. You. Oh, come on. Someone's pushing it, Matt muttered. But no one said anything. We were all glued to the board now. N. The candle flickered harder, almost going out, and my stomach dropped. Run, Erin whispered. It's telling us to run. We all sat there in dead silence, the weight of that word hanging in the air like a curse. None of us moved. I could feel the tension in the room tightening around us, like the walls themselves were closing in. Lisa was the first to break the silence, her voice shaky. It's just a stupid board. It's... Before she could finish, the candle went out. We were plunged into total darkness. The only sound was the wind howling outside, and the faint creak of the house settling, but it felt like something was shifting around us, something unseen. I wanted to say it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. What the hell? Matt started, but his voice trailed off. In the dark, I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, each beat slower, louder. Something wasn't right. Something was in the room with us. We should go, I whispered, my voice trembling. Lisa fumbled to find her phone, its screen lighting up the small space with an eerie blue glow. But just as she got a grip on it, we heard it. A low creak from the far corner of the basement, like footsteps on the old wooden floor. My entire body went cold. Who's down here? Josh's voice cracked as he stood up, looking around wildly. This isn't funny, guys. Nobody answered. We were all too scared to even breathe. Then the footsteps came again, closer this time. Run! Erin screamed, and we didn't wait to find out why. We bolted for the stairs, knocking over the Ouija board in the process. My legs felt like jelly, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I was the first one to reach the door, my hand fumbling with the lock as my heart pounded in my chest. It took what felt like hours to open it, and when we finally burst outside into the cold night air, I swear I heard something behind us, a whisper, a laugh, or maybe just the wind. We didn't stop running until we were halfway down the street. And when we finally did, gasping for breath, nobody said a word. We just stared at each other, The unspoken terror of what had just happened etched into all of our faces. Something had answered us. Something had warned us. And we should have listened. We didn't go back to Lisa's that night. We just sprinted, straight to the park down the road. It was the only place that felt far enough away from that basement, from whatever we'd stirred up. I think we were all too afraid to even think about what happened. Nobody spoke. I mean, what do you even say after something like that? After about half an hour, the adrenaline started to wear off, and the reality of it all hit us. Erin was the first to break the silence. Does anyone else feel different? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes darting around like she expected something to jump out at any second. Different how? Josh muttered, kicking at the gravel beneath the bench he was sitting on. Like we're not alone. Erin's voice shook, and she looked at each of us, hoping someone would tell her she was imagining things. But none of us could. Because deep down, we all felt it. That weird, crawling sensation, like eyes were on us, like something had followed us from the house. I hadn't wanted to admit it before, but the further we got from Lisa's, the more the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. Something was off. Maybe we didn't end the session right, Matt said, rubbing his temples. Isn't there some rule about saying goodbye? We didn't get a chance, Lisa replied, her voice hoarse. We ran before we could, close it. I wanted to tell them that it was all in their heads, that we were just freaked out because of the dark and the candle going out. But the words wouldn't come. My throat felt tight, like something was lodged there. I didn't want to scare them even more, but I felt like I was choking on that unspoken truth. I wasn't ready to admit it to myself, but something had followed us. The wind picked up, and for a second, I swore I heard whispering. It was faint, just below the sound of the rustling leaves, like voices carried on the breeze. I shot a glance at the others, but no one seemed to hear it. Or maybe they were just pretending not to. We should go back, Matt said suddenly, standing up. His eyes were wild, like he was already halfway out the door. Finish it properly, Just end it. Are you insane? Lisa snapped, shaking her head. Go back there, after what just happened. Guys, come on, Josh cut in, his voice steady, but his eyes betrayed him. Maybe it's not the board, maybe we're just freaking ourselves out. I'm not going back there, Erin said firmly, standing up. Not tonight, not ever. I could feel the tension between them growing, but my focus was elsewhere. My eyes drifted to the tree line at the edge of the park, and I froze. For a second, just a split second, I thought I saw something, a shadow, a figure. It was too far to be sure, but my stomach dropped. It wasn't moving, just standing there, blending into the darkness like it belonged there. I blinked, and it was gone. Did you guys see that? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. They all looked where I was pointing, but by then the figure was gone. They gave me that look, the one that says they wanted to believe me but weren't sure if I was losing it. See what? Josh asked, narrowing his eyes. There was something there, I muttered, feeling the chill creep into my bones. Standing by the trees, just watching. Okay, that's it, Erin said, her voice cracking. I'm done. I'm not staying out here any longer. We should just go home. All of us. None of us argued. Without another word, we got up and started walking back. But the strange feeling lingered. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on us. My mind raced, replaying every moment in that basement, every flicker of the candle, every creak of the floorboards. What did we let in? The streets were empty, eerily quiet for a Friday night. We walked together, sticking close, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us, lurking just beyond the edge of the streetlights. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadow again, We reached my house first, and I stopped at the front steps. Normally I'd say goodbye, but the words caught in my throat. I didn't want to be alone. None of us did. I could see it in their faces. "I'll see you guys tomorrow," I said. But my voice was hollow, like I didn't believe it. Josh gave me a nod, his jaw tight, and the others murmured something similar before continuing down the street. I watched them disappear around the corner, but even then, I felt like something was still there, lingering. I stepped inside and locked the door, leaning against it for a moment to catch my breath. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Normally I'd hear the TV from the living room or my parents talking. But tonight it felt like the entire world had gone mute. My heart pounded in my chest, and the silence wrapped itself around me like a noose. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard it. A faint creak from the kitchen, like someone or something was walking around. I froze, gripping the banister, straining to hear. Another creak, and then another. Someone was in my house. I slowly backed down the stairs, my feet moving quietly, trying not to make a sound. The floor groaned under me, and my breath caught in my throat. I tiptoed toward the kitchen, my hands trembling. The light was off, but the moonlight spilled through the window, casting strange shadows across the floor. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement. And then, just as I was about to step forward, I saw it. On the floor, in the moonlight, footprints, wet, muddy footprints, leading from the back door straight toward the staircase. They weren't mine, and they weren't my parents. I wasn't alone. I couldn't move. My eyes were glued to the footprints, my heart pounding so loud I swore it would give me away. They led from the back door, cutting through the kitchen like a trail of something sinister, up the stairs I had just been on moments ago. I stood there, frozen in place, the reality of it sinking in. There was someone, or something, in my house. The air in the kitchen felt wrong, like it had been sucked out, leaving only a dense, suffocating silence behind. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I tried to think of what to do next. Run outside? Call the police? Scream? But every option felt like it would end badly. I couldn't think straight. All I knew was that I needed to move, and fast. My phone was still in my pocket, but the idea of making noise, of letting whatever was upstairs know that I was there, felt like signing my own death warrant. I slowly backed up, my eyes never leaving the muddy trail, and reached for the front door. But just as my fingers brushed the doorknob, I heard it. A soft creak from above. I swallowed hard. My mind raced as I tried to figure out who or what could be up there. It couldn't be my parents. They weren't even home. They'd gone out for dinner, and I wasn't expecting them back until late. No, this wasn't them. This was something else. Something worse. My body felt like it was on autopilot as I slowly crept back toward the living room, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. I grabbed an umbrella from the coat rack. It was the closest thing I could find, and held it in front of me like it would somehow stop whatever was up there. My hands were shaking, and I could barely keep my grip on it, but I wasn't about to go upstairs unarmed. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the stairs. Each step felt like a countdown, like I was walking straight into something I couldn't turn back from. The house was dead silent again, but that only made it worse. The kind of silence where every little noise, every creak of the floor, every rustle of the wind felt amplified, like the house itself was watching. Halfway up the stairs, I heard it again, a soft shuffling sound, almost like something dragging itself across the floor. My grip on the umbrella tightened, and I forced myself to keep moving. The footsteps were closer now, impossibly close. And then, just as I reached the top step, I saw it, a figure, standing at the end of the hallway. It wasn't moving, just standing there, completely still, facing my bedroom door. I blinked, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. The figure was tall too tall to be anyone I knew. Its silhouette was all wrong, like it wasn't quite human. Its shoulders were hunched, its arms hanging unnaturally at its sides. My heart pounded in my ears, my pulse deafening. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything other than stand there, but I couldn't. My body wouldn't listen. It was like being trapped in a nightmare, where no matter how hard you try, you can't move, can't make a sound. The figure took a step toward my door, the floor creaking under its weight. That's when I saw it, something clutched in its hand. It was small, thin and flat. The planchette. The damn planchette from the Ouija board. I hadn't even realized I was holding my breath until it escaped me in a quiet gasp. The figure froze, as if it had heard me. Its head tilted ever so slightly to the side, and then, in one horrifyingly slow motion, it turned to face me. I couldn't see its eyes. Its face was shadowed, blurred by the dim light. But I could feel it staring at me, like it was looking right through me. The air turned cold, colder than it should have been for late fall, and I felt that same suffocating pressure from the basement, like the walls were closing in. The figure took another step, then another, its movements slow, deliberate. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. My legs refused to move, and all I could do was stand there as it came closer. It reached the middle of the hallway, and that's when the smell hit me. Damp earth, rot like something had crawled out from a grave and brought the stench of decay with it. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to gag. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and bolted down the stairs, the umbrella clattering to the floor behind me. My feet barely touched the steps as I ran, my heart racing like it was about to explode. I made it to the front door, yanking it open so hard I nearly ripped it off its hinges. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't stop. I kept running, out into the street, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. When I finally stopped, I was at the corner of the block, panting, my chest burning. I glanced back toward my house, half expecting to see the figure standing in the doorway. But the street was empty, silent. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to wrap my mind around what had just happened. There was no way this was real. It couldn't be. This was the kind of thing you saw in horror movies, not real life. But the smell, the footprints, the figure with the planchette, it all felt too real. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go back. I wasn't ready to face whatever that thing was. So I did the only thing I could think of. I called Lisa. "Hello!" Her voice was groggy, like she'd just woken up. "Lisa, you need to come over." My voice was shaking, barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong." "What do you mean? What's going on?" "There's something in my house," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder again, even though I knew the street was still empty. "It's the Ouija board. I think it followed me." There was a long pause on the other end. When she spoke again, her voice was tense, like she didn't want to believe it. "I'll be right there." I hung up and stood there, shivering in the cold night air. Whatever we'd unleashed, it wasn't finished with us yet. Lisa showed up faster than I expected, her car's headlights cutting through the dark as she pulled up to the curb. I don't think I've ever been more relieved to see someone. She got out and hurried toward me, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. I could tell from the way her hands shook as she shoved her phone into her jacket pocket that she was just as freaked out as I was. "What the hell happened?" she asked, her eyes darting from me to the house. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words got stuck. How was I supposed to tell her what I saw without sounding completely insane? "There's someone in the house," I finally managed, my voice shaky. It had the planchette, Lisa. The one from your basement." Lisa's face went pale. "That's not possible," she whispered. "We left it there. I remember seeing it on the floor when we ran out." "I know, but it's in there, and whatever it is, it isn't human." I shivered at the memory of that thing standing in my hallway, Its twisted silhouette burned into my mind. Lisa looked over at my house, her brow furrowing. She didn't want to believe me, I could tell, but something in her gut was telling her that I wasn't lying. "We should go check," she said, her voice steady, though I could see her hands trembling. "Are you crazy? I'm not going back in there." I took a step back, the fear from earlier creeping up on me again. We have to end this," Lisa insisted. "What if it's still following us? What if running away just made it worse?" I hated that she was right. Something had followed us, and it wasn't going to stop just because we were scared. I nodded reluctantly, and the two of us crept toward the front door. My heart was pounding again, the tension thick enough to choke on. The door was still open from when I'd run out earlier, and as soon as we stepped inside, the smell hit us. It was stronger now, like rot and mildew, the stench of something long dead. Lisa gagged, covering her nose with her sleeve. "This is worse than before," she muttered. "It's like something's rotting in here." I didn't respond, too focused on the silence that filled the house. It was unnerving, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. We moved quietly, inching through the living room and into the hallway. The muddy footprints were still there, leading up the stairs, but now they were smeared, as if whatever had made them had dragged itself down. Lisa's eyes followed the trail, and I could see the realization dawning on her face. This wasn't just a spirit. This was something physical, something that could move, that could leave evidence of its presence. "We have to go upstairs," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to argue, to tell her it was a terrible idea, but I knew she was right. We had to figure out what this thing wanted, and if that meant going back up those stairs, so be it. We moved slowly, the floor creaking beneath our feet as we ascended. I kept my eyes on the footprints, half expecting them to shift, to change before our eyes, but they stayed frozen in place, leading us toward the unknown. When we reached the top, I felt the air grow heavier, colder. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the small window at the end. My bedroom door was still closed, but there was something different now. The atmosphere around it felt oppressive, like the very air around it was humming with energy. Lisa and I exchanged a glance, and without a word, she reached out and turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing my room, empty at first glance. But as we stepped inside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The planchette was on the floor, placed neatly in the center of the room. Around it, etched into the hardwood floor, were symbols, strange, jagged shapes I didn't recognize. It looked like someone, or something, had carved them in. "What the hell is this?" Lisa whispered, kneeling down to inspect the markings. She ran her fingers over one of the symbols, her brow furrowing. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was stare at the planchette, at the way it sat so perfectly centered, like it was waiting for us. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from it as possible, but something kept me rooted in place. Then, the temperature dropped. It was subtle at first, like a cool breeze sweeping through the room, but it quickly grew colder, colder than it should have been. My breath came out in puffs of white, and I saw Lisa's eyes widen in terror as she realized what was happening. "Something's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden chill that filled the air. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, a sickly green light pulsing from them. And then I heard it, a low guttural whisper, so quiet I couldn't make out the words, but it was there, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Lisa scrambled back, her eyes wide with panic. "We need to leave, now!" But before we could move, the planchette jerked across the floor. It was subtle, just a tiny movement, but it was enough to send my heart into overdrive. It dragged itself toward the edge of one of the symbols, and then it stopped. The whispering grew louder, and suddenly the room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. The light from the symbols flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. I tried to back away, but but my legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the floor. "We're not alone," Lisa breathed, her voice trembling. "It's here. It's in the room with us." My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The air was thick with the presence of something unseen, something watching us, waiting. I could feel its gaze on me, could hear its breath, slow and deliberate, filling the room. And then, the planchette moved again, scraping across the floor with a screech that made my skin crawl. It spelled out one word, Leave. "We have to go," I whispered, grabbing Lisa's arm. "We can't stay here." But as we turned to flee, the door slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the house like a gunshot. The symbols on the floor flared, bright and angry, and the whispering rose to a deafening crescendo, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. Words I didn't want to understand. Something didn't want us to leave. The door slammed with such force that I thought the hinges might break. Lisa and I were trapped. The room instantly felt smaller, tighter, like the walls were squeezing us into the center. My pulse raced as the whispering turned into a cacophony, filling every inch of the space around us. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was voices, overlapping, tangled, desperate, and they were getting louder. Lisa grabbed my hand, her grip ice cold, and I could see the terror etched across her face. She was shaking, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, but the words wouldn't come, because I wasn't sure it would be okay. The planchette continued to scrape across the floor, jerking in erratic movements now, as if it were being pulled by invisible hands. It was writing something, but I couldn't make out the letters in the chaos. My eyes darted toward the symbols, now glowing brighter, pulsating like a heartbeat. The air was thick, heavy, almost unbreathable. Suddenly the whispering stopped. Dead silence. It was almost worse than the noise. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow, and Lisa's beside me. We stood there, frozen, waiting for whatever was next. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It slithered across the far wall, slow and deliberate, stretching unnaturally long. It wasn't just a trick of the light. This shadow had mass, substance. I could feel it, the cold seeping into my skin, deeper than any chill from the night air. Lisa's grip tightened, her nails digging into my arm as she saw it too. The shadow moved, creeping toward us inch by inch. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the floor, as if the very house had trapped me, rooting me in place. The shadow shifted, taking shape, growing taller, more defined, and then it stepped forward. It wasn't like before, when the figure had been vague, obscured by the dark. This was clear, detailed in a way that made my stomach turn. It looked human, but wrong. Its limbs too long, its movements unnatural, like it didn't quite know how to use its body. Its face, though, was the worst part. It was featureless, just a blank, smooth surface, where eyes and a mouth should have been. But somehow, I knew it was watching us. I don't know how, but I knew. The planchette clattered to a stop, and I glanced down at the board. It had spelled out one final word, R-U-N. It was too late. There was nowhere to go. The door was sealed shut, and the thing was blocking our only exit. I felt trapped, suffocated, like a cornered animal. I wanted to scream, to cry, to do something, but fear had me in a chokehold. Lisa whispered something, but I couldn't hear her. My mind was spinning, every nerve in my body on high alert. The figure stepped closer, slow, deliberate, its blank face somehow filled with malice. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it looking right into me, as if it could see every thought, every fear. Lisa moved first. She yanked me toward the window, her fingers fumbling with the lock. "Help me!" she whispered, her voice hoarse with panic. I snapped out of my paralysis and rushed to her side. throwing the window open as fast as I could. The cold night air rushed in, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could make it out. Maybe we could escape. But then the figure lunged. It didn't make a sound, but I felt it, felt the shift in the air, the weight of its presence bearing down on us. Lisa screamed, a high, piercing sound that sent shivers down my spine. She grabbed onto the windowsill, half climbing through, but the figure was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. It grabbed her leg, pulling her back with such force that she nearly slipped from my grasp. I held onto her with everything I had, my knuckles turning white as I tried to pull her free. But the figure was strong. Too strong. "Let go of me!" she shrieked, her voice a mix of terror and desperation. I could see the panic in her eyes, the sheer horror of what was happening, but I didn't let go. I couldn't. The room seemed to darken, the light from the symbols flickering like a dying flame. The air grew colder, and I could feel the pressure building, pressing down on us. The shadow figure was relentless, its grip on Lisa unyielding. I pulled harder, my muscles burning, but it was like trying to pull her from quicksand. And then, with one final, gut-wrenching yank, Lisa was ripped from my grasp. I fell back, crashing into the floor, my breath knocked out of me. I watched in horror as the figure dragged her toward the center of the room, toward the glowing symbols, her screams echoing in the small space. She kicked and fought, but it was no use. The figure was stronger, faster, and I could see the defeat in her eyes as it pulled her closer and closer to the planchette. "Help me!" she screamed, reaching out toward me, her eyes wide with terror. I scrambled to my feet, rushing toward her, but before I could reach her, the symbols flared with a blinding light. I was thrown back, the force of it knocking me off my feet. I hit the wall hard, my vision blurring, the room spinning. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, Lisa was gone. The room was empty. The planchette lay still on the floor, the glow from the symbols fading into nothingness. I blinked, my heart pounding in my ears, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I was alone. The door creaked open slowly, as if inviting me to leave. I stumbled to my feet, my body shaking uncontrollably. My legs felt weak, barely able to carry me, but I forced myself to move. I had to get out. I had to get help. I made it out of the house, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I stumbled into the street. The night was quiet, eerily so, as if the world itself was unaware of the horror that had just unfolded inside. I don't know what happened to Lisa. I don't know what we unleashed or why it chose her. But I know one thing. We should have listened. The board warned us. And now I'm the only one left to remember. The Ouija board told us not to stop playing. Now it won't let us leave. It started as a regular Saturday night hangout. My friends and I, bored out of our minds, decided to meet at Liz's house. She always had this thing for creepy stuff. Her room was decorated with skulls, vintage horror movie posters, and shelves filled with crystals and tarot cards. That night, she casually mentioned she had bought a Ouija board. We all laughed it off at first, even joked about it. None of us really believed in that stuff, or so we said. But there was a part of me that didn't want to touch it, not even to joke around. "Come on, it'll be fun," Liz urged, already pulling the box out from under her bed. It was one of those cheap boards you could buy at any toy store, but something about it felt wrong. Maybe it was the way the candlelight flickered a little too violently as soon as she set it down, or maybe it was the eerie silence that followed, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I wasn't the only one hesitating. Mark, the skeptic of the group, rolled his eyes but sat down anyway, trying to act cool. Jen, who was usually the bravest, was uncharacteristically quiet. She kept looking at the board like it was something venomous. And then there was me. I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I sat down too. What could really happen? We gathered around the board, with Liz lighting a few more candles to set the mood. It all felt so staged, like one of those low-budget horror flicks, except this was real life. Liz slid the planchette onto the board, and we all placed our fingers lightly on it. The wood felt unnaturally cold against my skin. "Is there anyone here with us?" Liz asked, her voice almost mocking. I could hear the playful smirk behind her words. We all waited, the silence in the room suddenly becoming suffocating. The candles flickered again, and I noticed that the temperature in the room had dropped. That was weird. Liz, still in her playful tone, asked another question. "If there's a spirit here, give us a sign." The planchette didn't move. We all sat there, fingers resting lightly on it, waiting for something to happen. I could feel the awkwardness building, the kind you get when no one knows what to say. Just as I was about to pull my hand away and call it quits, the planchette slid. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, but enough for us all to notice. "What the?" Mark whispered, his voice dropping the sarcasm he'd had earlier. "Did someone move it?" I asked, looking around at my friends, but they all looked as confused as I was. Liz, her usual grin fading, tried to play it off. "Come on, it's probably nothing. Let's ask it another question." This time, Jen spoke up. "Wait, shouldn't we ask if it's okay to stop?" Liz paused, rolling her eyes. "We barely even started. What's the worst that could happen?" Mark and I exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to be the one to back out. Liz was already asking more questions, this time more seriously. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost as if she was afraid of the answer. The planchette slid again, this time more deliberately. Slowly, it spelled out a name. A L-E-X. None of us knew an Alex. At least not one who had passed on. "Okay, that's enough," Jen said, sounding more freaked out than before. She lifted her fingers off the board, and I followed, but Liz wasn't done. "No, we have to finish it properly," she insisted. "You can't just leave it hanging like that." Her eyes darted around the room nervously, like she was suddenly aware of something we couldn't see. Mark stood up, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm done. This is stupid. It's probably just our subconscious moving it anyway." But just as he was about to leave, the planchette jerked violently to the side, dragging Liz's hand with it. Her eyes widened in shock, and we all stared as it spelled out two more words: "Don't stop." For a moment, no one moved. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the soft, steady flicker of the candles. Liz looked up at us, her face pale, her voice barely above a whisper. What do we do? I wanted to say something, to tell her to stop playing around, that this was just some elaborate prank she was pulling on us. But the words wouldn't come. There was something about the way the room felt, like it was watching us, like it was waiting for something. "We should just leave," Jen suggested, backing away from the board. But Liz shook her head. Number It said not to stop. It was the way she said it, with this strange mix of fear and certainty, that sent a shiver crawling down my spine. I glanced at Mark, who looked just as freaked out as I felt. This wasn't fun anymore, but before we could decide what to do next, the front door slammed shut, hard, as if someone, or something, had decided for us. That's when the whispers started. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house like a gunshot, and my stomach dropped. Liz's eyes darted to the door, her face pale. Mark was already halfway across the room, reaching for the doorknob, when it happened. The whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind. It had to be, right? A gust pushing through the cracks of an old house, maybe even rattling a few windows. But these whispers were different. They were coming from inside the room, soft, unintelligible murmurs, like someone was standing right behind us, just out of view. Mark froze, his hand inches from the doorknob. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered, barely audible over the faint voices. None of us answered. We didn't have to. The look on our faces said it all. Liz slowly turned back to the board, her hand trembling as she reached for the planchette. But before she could touch it, the whispers grew louder. They weren't just random murmurs anymore. They were voices, many voices, overlapping, like a crowd trying to talk all at once. Some sounded angry, others desperate. I could hear snatches of words, but they didn't make sense, like fragments of a conversation you'd catch in passing. I wanted to move, to grab my things and run out of that house, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might explode. Jen stood frozen, her wide eyes staring at nothing, like she was trying to process what was happening. And then one voice cut through the others, clear as day. "You can't leave." It was a woman's voice, cold, flat, and emotionless. It sounded like it was coming from right next to me, but when I turned, there was nothing, just the empty space where the shadows flickered in the candlelight. Mark yanked the door open, but before he could take a step, the door slammed shut again, with a force that shook the whole house. He stumbled back, looking at the door in disbelief. "What the hell is going on?" he hissed, his voice strained with panic. Liz was still staring at the board. "It said we couldn't stop," she muttered, more to herself than to us. "It told us not to stop." I stepped closer to her, careful not to touch the board. "We need to leave. This isn't a game anymore." She shook her head, biting her lip. "We can't. I think it's angry." The whispers surged again, louder this time, almost deafening. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on us. I could barely hear my own thoughts over the chorus of voices. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped. Silence. Utter, terrifying silence. Liz swallowed hard, her hand hovering above the planchette, hesitant. "We need to ask it what it wants," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Before any of us could protest, she placed her fingers back on the planchette. I watched as her hands trembled. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice shaking. The planchette didn't move. Not at first. But then, slowly, it began to glide across the board, spelling out a single word. "Stay." Jen gasped, taking a step back, her face drained of all colour. Mark shook his head in disbelief. "This is insane. We're not staying here. We're leaving. Now." But the second he said it, the air in the room shifted. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt heavier, like a weight pressing down on us. And then we heard it, the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming from the hallway. We all turned to face the door, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped right outside the room, just beyond the door. My skin crawled as the doorknob began to turn, ever so slowly. The door creaked open, just a crack, enough for a sliver of darkness to spill into the room. We all stood frozen, waiting, expecting something, someone, to walk through that door. But nothing did. Instead, the whispers returned, this time coming from inside the room again, louder, angrier. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was clear they didn't want us to leave. Liz's eyes filled with panic as she looked at me. "We have to finish the session. If we don't close it properly, we'll be stuck." "Stuck? What do you mean, stuck?" Jen's voice was trembling, her hands gripping the back of the chair for support. "I mean, stuck here," Liz whispered, barely able to say the words. "It won't let us go." Mark banged on the door in frustration, but it wouldn't budge. "Screw this, I'm not staying here." As he said it, the planchette shot across the board, faster than I'd ever seen, spelling out another word, "Stay." The room felt alive with tension. The candles flickered wildly, casting strange, distorted shadows on the walls. I tried to move, but every muscle in my body felt paralyzed with fear. And then, for the first time, I realized something horrifying. There was something else in the room with us. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The air around me was thick with its presence, like it was standing right beside me, just out of reach. My breath caught in my throat as the whispers grew louder again, filling my head with voices that didn't belong to any of us. Liz's voice trembled as she tried to ask another question, but her words were drowned out by the chaos of the whispers. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it again. That same cold, flat voice that had told us we couldn't leave. "You're not going anywhere." The voice sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't need to see it to know that whatever was in this house wasn't going to let us go. Not until it was finished with us. The air had become suffocating. It wasn't just the whispers or the cold spots that seemed to follow us around the room. There was something else, something darker, that made my skin crawl. None of us could say it out loud, but we all knew the truth. We weren't alone, not anymore. Liz's face had drained of all colour. She looked like she was on the verge of tears, her hands shaking as they hovered over the Ouija board. "We have to ask it how to end this. We can't just leave without closing the session. If we do..." Her voice trailed off, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. We all understood. Something had been invited into the house, and now it was playing by its own rules. "Just ask it," Mark snapped, his voice breaking through the oppressive silence. He was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, glaring at the board as if it had personally wronged him. "Ask it how we can make it stop." Liz nodded shakily, her fingers returning to the planchette. The moment she touched it, the whispers swelled again, louder and more aggressive, like a swarm of angry bees buzzing in my ears. I had to grit my teeth to block them out. "What do we need to do to leave?" Liz asked, her voice barely audible over the noise. The planchette didn't move at first, and I could see her fingers twitching as if she was fighting the urge to pull away. Then, ever so slowly, the planchette started to slide, spelling out words in short, jerky movements. "You can't." Jen let out a small whimper, backing away from the board. "Number, no. This can't be real. It's just messing with us. It has to be." But I knew. I knew deep down that this was no joke. Something had changed the moment we asked the wrong question, and now we were playing a game we didn't understand. "What do you mean we can't leave?" Mark growled, stepping toward the board. His frustration was palpable, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He was just as scared as the rest of us, no matter how hard he tried to hide it. The planchette jerked to life again, moving quickly across the board, spelling out something new. "You stay until it ends." "Until what ends?" Liz asked, her voice cracking. The planchette didn't answer. Instead, the whispers grew louder, swirling around us in an incoherent jumble of voices. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, and I could see my breath fogging in the dim candlelight. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, twisting into unnatural shapes that looked like figures, but not human ones. Suddenly, the door creaked open wider, the gap revealing a dark hallway that seemed far longer than it should have been. I could feel something in the hallway, just out of sight, watching us, waiting. "We need to get out of here," Jen whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to get out right now." Mark grabbed the door again, yanking it open as wide as it would go. But as soon as he stepped toward it, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, the sudden lack of sound almost worse than the constant murmurs. And then, without warning, the planchette flew off the board, landing with a loud clatter across the room. We all froze, staring at it in shock. It lay there on the floor, still and lifeless, but the message was clear. We were no longer in control. "Why did it stop?" Liz asked, her voice a whisper. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely keep them on the edge of the table. I glanced toward the door. It was still open, but there was no way I was going out there, not with whatever was lurking in the hallway. Maybe it's over." Jen shook her head, backing away from the board. "Number something's wrong. I can feel it." And she was right. The air had changed again, this time thick with something far more sinister than before. It wasn't just the whispers or the cold. It was like the house itself was alive, watching us, testing us. Then came the sound. Not whispers this time, but a slow, deliberate knock. 3 times, echoing through the house from somewhere upstairs. My heart skipped a beat, and I shot a look at Mark, who was standing by the door. "Did you hear that?" He didn't answer, His eyes were fixed on the dark hallway, his jaw clenched, hands balled into fists. Whatever was out there, it was closer now. I could feel it. Another knock, closer this time, like it was moving down the stairs. Liz stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, her face pale. We need to finish the session. If we don't, it won't let us leave. That's what it meant. Mark turned to her, his face a mask of frustration and fear. Finish it? How the hell do we finish it? I don't know, she cried, her voice breaking. We have to ask it. We have to... The third knock came, so loud it rattled the walls. And this time, it was right outside the door. None of us moved. We couldn't. It was like our bodies had frozen in place, paralyzed by the terror that was now suffocating the room. I wanted to speak, to tell them we needed to get out. But my throat was dry, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The door creaked, swinging open wider, revealing nothing. Just the empty hallway. But I knew better. Whatever had been knocking wasn't finished with us. Ask it, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own racing pulse. Liz nodded, her hand shaking as she reached for the planchette again. The moment her fingers touched it, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The planchette moved violently, spelling out one final word before it stopped for good. Play. The candles flickered wildly, the shadows stretching and distorting in ways that made me feel sick. I didn't need to look at the others to know what that word meant. We weren't just players in a game. We were the pieces. And now, the board wasn't going to let us leave until the game was over. Whatever that meant. The board had spoken. Play. The word hung in the air, suffocating us as much as the icy cold that had settled over the room. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind was racing, trying to grasp what play meant. But deep down, I knew. We were trapped. The game had only just begun. Jen took a step backward, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. Maybe we can call someone, she said, her voice shaky, barely more than a whisper. Mark shook his head, his jaw clenched. And say what? That we're being held hostage by a board game. They'll think we're insane. Liz, still clutching the planchette like a lifeline, muttered, "We have to keep going. If we don't play, it'll never stop." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to scream at her, tell her to shut up, to stop touching the damn board, but I couldn't. My mouth felt dry, my body frozen in place. Something in the room had shifted. The air was thicker, heavier, like something was waiting, watching. And then, from somewhere deep in the house, came a sound. It was faint at first, almost like scratching. I strained to listen, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. It grew louder, more deliberate, like nails scraping against wood. It was coming from behind the walls, moving slowly, as if something, or someone, was trying to get in. Jen gasped, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. "What is that?" None of us answered. We didn't need to. The answer was all around us, in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very foundation of the house. Whatever we had summoned wasn't just in the room. It was everywhere. Mark was the first to break. He lunged toward the door again, yanking on the handle with all his strength. "We need to leave. Screw the game. Screw the board. I'm not staying here another second." But the door wouldn't budge. No matter how hard he pulled, it stayed firmly shut, as if the house itself had decided to lock us in. "Stop it! You're only making it worse!" Liz cried, her voice frantic. "We have to finish what we started." Mark shot her a look of pure anger. "Finish what? We don't even know what we're supposed to do." Before Liz could respond, the scratching sound intensified. It was no longer coming from just one place. It was all around us now, closing in. And then, in a low, guttural voice that made my skin crawl, I heard it again. Play. This time, there was no mistaking it. The voice wasn't coming from the board or the walls. It was coming from right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room and the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could feel my pulse quickening, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Liz's hands were trembling as she grabbed the planchette again, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to keep playing. If we don't, it'll come for us." I didn't want to believe her, but there was no denying the fear in her eyes. She wasn't just scared, she was terrified. And for the first time that night, I realized something. Liz wasn't the one controlling the game. The game was controlling her. "Ask it what it wants," Jen whispered, her eyes darting around the room like she expected something to crawl out of the walls at any moment. "Just ask it what we need to do to end this." Liz hesitated, her fingers hovering over the board. She swallowed hard, then whispered, "What do you want?" The planchette didn't move for a long moment, and I held my breath, praying for it to stay still, for this nightmare to end. But it didn't. Slowly, deliberately, the planchette began to slide across the board, spelling out a single word. "One." "One what?" Mark snapped, his voice filled with frustration and panic. "What the hell does that mean?" Liz didn't answer. She didn't have to. The moment the word appeared, the scratching stopped. Silence fell over the room once more, thick and oppressive. But it wasn't the kind of silence that brought relief. No, this silence was worse. It was the kind that suffocated you, that filled every crevice of your mind with dread. And then, almost imperceptibly, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath fogging in the air, feel the icy chill seeping into my bones. Jen's teeth were chattering, her eyes wide with terror. "I think it wants one of us," Liz whispered, her voice trembling. Mark froze, his face pale. "One of us? You mean, like a sacrifice?" The thought hung in the air, heavy and terrifying. None of us dared to speak, but we all knew. The game wasn't going to end until it got what it wanted. Suddenly the candles flickered violently, the flames sputtering as if an invisible hand was smothering them. The room grew darker, the shadows stretching longer, almost reaching for us. I backed away from the board, my heart pounding in my chest. "We can't do this. We can't just..." Before I could finish, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more urgent, and among the chaotic murmur of voices, I heard that same cold, emotionless voice, clear as day. "One must stay." Jen shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "Number no, this isn't happening. We can't..." The lights flickered again, casting the room in a strobe of eerie light and shadow. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, came a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. "We have to play," Liz said, her voice firm but trembling. "If we don't, none of us are getting out of here alive." I wanted to scream at her, to rip the board off the table and smash it into pieces, but something stopped me. A presence. It was closer now, right on the edge of my vision, lurking just out of sight. I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and cold. And then, as if the house itself was giving us one final warning, the door slammed shut again, sealing us inside. The game wasn't over. It was just getting started. The door slammed shut so hard it rattled the walls, sending a gust of cold air through the room that extinguished all but one candle. The last flame flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a painful reminder that time was running out. Whatever we were dealing with was no longer just playing games. "We need to stop this," I said, my voice cracking. "We can't keep going." Liz shook her head, her fingers still trembling on the planchette. "We don't have a choice. If we stop now, it'll take all of us." Her words sent a jolt of fear through me, but there was something else in her eyes now. Something different. It wasn't just fear. It was resignation. Liz had already made up her mind. She was ready to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. Mark stood by the door, his hands clenched into fists. He looked ready to punch a hole through the wall. but the futility of it all weighed him down. "So what's the move?" he demanded, his voice barely masking the fear that cracked at the edges. "What the hell do we do?" Liz took a deep breath and placed both hands on the planchette. "We have to make a decision." "A decision?" Jen's voice was trembling, and she had backed herself into a corner, hugging her knees like she was trying to disappear. "What decision?" The whispers returned, low and barely audible, crawling under our skin like 1,000 insects skittering through the room. The single candle flickered again, but this time the flame stretched, unnaturally long, as though something was breathing down its neck. And then, as if the house was speaking directly to us, the cold, emotionless voice echoed through the air once more. "One stays. The rest may go." The words hung in the room like a noose tightening around our throats. Jen shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "Number no, it's lying. It's just trying to mess with us." Mark took a step toward the board, his expression hardening. "So that's it? We just pick someone to stay, and the rest of us get to leave?" "It's not going to give us any other choice," Liz whispered, her voice barely holding together. She looked up at me, her eyes hollow, filled with the weight of everything that had happened. "Someone has to stay behind. That's the only way." I didn't want to believe her. I wanted to fight, to scream, to tear the board apart, but there was something inside me that already knew the truth. The game wasn't bluffing. It had never been a game at all. It was a trap, and we had walked right into it. The scratching started again, louder now, more aggressive. This time, it wasn't just behind the walls. It was in the room, moving closer. I could feel something circling us, a presence that grew more oppressive with every second. It was closing in. "We have to make a decision," Liz cried, her voice breaking. The planchette jerked violently across the board, spelling out the same word over and over. "Stay, stay, stay." Jen let out a sob, backing further into the corner. "I'm not staying. I'm not doing this." Liz stood up, her hands shaking as she moved away from the board. "We have to choose. If we don't..." Her voice trailed off, but the meaning was clear. If we didn't choose, the board would make the choice for us. Mark turned to me, his face pale but determined. "We can't just let this thing take one of us. There has to be another way out." But before he could say anything else, the planchette stopped moving. It slid across the board, spelling out one final word. "You." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the board, the realization slowly sinking in. It had chosen me. The room grew impossibly cold, the candlelight barely illuminating the shadows that twisted and writhed along the walls. I could feel the presence now, right behind me, breathing down my neck. Jen's sobs filled the room, and Liz stood paralyzed, her face a mask of horror. Mark cursed under his breath, slamming his fist against the wall in frustration. But it didn't matter. The decision had been made. "You can't do this," Mark said, his voice cracking. "We're not leaving you behind." But I knew it wasn't up to them anymore. Whatever was controlling this game had already made its choice, and now there was only one way out. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my shaking hands. "It's okay," I said, barely believing the words myself. "If this is what it takes to end it, then I'll stay." "No," Jen cried, her voice breaking. "There has to be another way." But there wasn't. We all knew it. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the house itself was waiting for me to make my move. I took a deep breath and stepped toward the board. The room seemed to grow darker with every step, the shadows reaching out like hands ready to drag me down into whatever hell awaited. The planchette lay still now, silent, as if waiting for me to seal my fate. "Go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You guys need to leave, while you still can." Liz's eyes were wide with terror, but she didn't argue. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Mark stood frozen for a moment, his fists clenched, before he finally turned and grabbed Jen's arm, pulling her toward the door. As they reached the doorway, the room seemed to breathe again. The cold receded slightly, the whispers dying down to a low murmur. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the dark hallway beyond. But I stayed where I was, my feet rooted to the floor. I could feel the presence all around me now, closing in, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. The game had been won, and I was the prize. I looked at Liz, Mark, and Jen one last time as they hesitated in the doorway, their faces etched with guilt and fear. "Go," I repeated, more forcefully this time, "before it changes its mind." With a final, reluctant glance, they disappeared into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind them with a soft click. And then I was alone. The silence was deafening. The last candle flickered one last time before going out, plunging the room into complete darkness. I could feel it now, the thing that had been watching us all along. It was here, with me. I didn't try to run. There was no point. The game was over, and I had lost.